One of the great myths of American political culture revolves around rugged individualism and free market capitalism, a meritocracy based on the idea that individual worth is achieved by the virtue of one's own merit. However, the United States was not founded on free market principles, nor does it follow them today. Our system, as libertarians are quick to point out, is not capitalist, but rather a highly protectionist, government-sanctioned monopoly that acts as a welfare state for the rich. The idea that the U.S. was founded on free market principles has been proclaimed for decades. However, without government and government protection, the U.S. as we know it today would not exist. Despite the free market myth, the early American government instituted tariffs to keep out superior British manufactured goods, passed congressional legislation protecting business, issued land grants as well as government bonds, built roads, canals, and railways, and passed laws that spurred homesteading. Not to mention the U.S. was built on the government-backed removal of one race and the enslavement of another. It's hard to think of two greater violations of market principles than state-sanctioned genocide and slavery. Even America's Wild West, a period greatly exaggerated and mythologized as a time where restless, rugged young men set out on their own, free from government and big business to achieve the American dream, bears little, if any, resemblance to reality. Most people who migrated west went not as individuals, but as smaller parts of extended families or even entire migrant groups. Ranchers who were given land the size of counties were backed by and represented bourgeois interests in Chicago, New York, and London. Even the cowboy, who embodies the image of American autonomy, was anything but. In reality, cowboys weren't individuals in control of their own fate, but rather grossly underpaid wage workers who were mercilessly exploited by newly formed corporations and their client ranchers. Not to mention all the cowboys driving cattle across the untamed wilderness were headed to towns that developed along railroads thanks to government procurement. However, there were people who thought they could make it on their own. In an attempt to build a system truly free of government interference and collectivism, Josiah Warren set up sovereign communities like Utopia, Ohio, and modern times New York, where individuals could engage in equitable commerce with no constraints. However, since there was no regulation, no standards, no laws, and no shared communal values or visions, Warren's truly free market societies were individualism on steroids and collapsed in spectacular fashion. The point is, the U.S. developed specifically because it rejected free market principles. On a global scale, did any country that embraced free market principles develop? The historical record sheds a lot of light on this. In the 18th century, when capitalism was beginning to emerge as a major economic system, only three regions developed: Western Europe, the United States, and Japan. Oddly, these were the only three areas to reject the free market in favor of tariffs and protectionism. Western Europe and the regions that managed to stay free of its control developed, as Europe itself did, by radical violation of these principles. In fact, the first and third worlds developed along these lines. Free market capitalism does exist in a great deal of the third world, which is exactly why the third world looks the way it does. Countries like Egypt and India, who were poised for industrial development, had the free market shoved down their throats with well-documented results. In fact, the only country in the global south that developed was, as we already mentioned, Japan, who was able to resist the West's market fundamentalism. And it's doubtful that the central U.S. sectors of industry like steel, automotive, machine tools, or semiconductors could have survived Japanese competition or been able to forge ahead in emerging technologies. Last, let's take a look at Ronald Reagan, the apostle of neoliberalism. Reagan and his administration extolled the glories of the free market, at least for the poor. However, with regards to business, the Reaganites doubled import restrictions and stepped up the transfer of public funds to private enterprises. In fact, Reagan's Treasury Secretary, James Baker, openly bragged about the administration's role in protecting U.S. business interests, saying, "They granted more import relief to U.S. industry than any of his predecessors in more than half a century." Newt Gingrich continued Reagan's free market tradition by condemning all those who looked to the government for aid. Meanwhile, Cobb County, Georgia, the district he represented, received the third highest amount of federal subsidies next to D.C., of course, and Brevard County, Florida, home to NASA. Together, Reagan and Gingrich, with the help of the Clinton administration, proved Martin Luther King Jr.'s dictum that this country has socialism for the rich, rugged individualism for the poor. It has long been argued that socialism has never worked, but the Paris Commune, the Hungarian Soviet Republic, the Free Socialist Republic of Germany, the Free Territory of Ukraine, Revolutionary Catalonia, Salvador Allende's Chile, Maurice Bishop's Grenada, and Chiapas, Mexico are just a few examples of successful socialist experiments that worked until they were crushed by outside capitalist forces. My question to you is, has free market capitalism ever worked? Once, anywhere, ever, in the history of the world? Most of us take for granted that the US was built on the back of hardworking individuals competing in unrestricted competition, yet there's virtually no evidence to support this. It seems that the myth of the American free market, which has now become a political dogma, can't stand up to the slightest scrutiny. Perhaps it was put best by the great post-war economic historian Paul Bairoch, who said, "It's difficult to find another case where the facts so contradict a dominant theory." Thanks for watching.